Everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to be talking about cybersecurity and resilience for MSPs in the light of the new Cybersecurity and Cyber Resilience Bill that will soon become an act. I'm joined today by my expert panel, David Clark, Oliver, and Robert, both from defense.com. So I'd start by asking you all to introduce yourselves. David.
Hi, thanks, Penny. Yeah, my background is cybersecurity and data protection. At one time, I was responsible for cybersecurity on, at the time, the world's largest private trading network in the world, trading $3.5 trillion a day. And kind of recently, co-author of three or four ICO certified GDPR schemes.
Thanks, David. And you and I set up the TrustBridge 8 or so years ago now, and we've been helping a number of organizations, both with their GDPR and their cybersecurity governance and compliance. And we're now working in the MSP space with both MSPs and their clients together. And that's how we came across Oliver and Robert. So, Oliver, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Penny. My name's Ollie Pinzer-Roxburgh. I'm the co-founder and CEO of defense.com. So our platform's been developed over 7 years or so to help organizations and MSPs to improve their cybersecurity. But our primary focus is to help MSP organizations to identify where an organization might have gaps in their security and compliance and help consolidate that into a place where they can really manage security in a more effective way, and also provide response actions to help address problems when they happen from a cybersecurity perspective. I've been in cybersecurity for over 20 years, done a variation of different things, from actually being a penetration tester in the past, breaking into buildings, showing people how to access them. I've tried bribing people. I've done all sorts of things in my career to help educate people how to improve security. So really looking forward to talking about this topic actually today, to sort of continue the education really and share our knowledge on what we're seeing. And so, yeah, that's me.
You were ahead of the curve then, in many ways.
Wonderful.
And Robert.
Well, I'm Robert McKee. I'm the head of sales for defense.com. I work more on the ground floor with MSPs and their clients to really understand their struggles within the cybersecurity realm, how we can accommodate and give them solutions that help their client, and then also the feedback that they're getting from the client perspective is their new roles and responsibility in the cyber evolving landscape.
Yeah. And that's the thing, isn't it? With the new Cyber Resilience Act on its way, things are changing for the MSP. So it's key for them to understand their responsibilities and their liability to their customers and their stakeholders under these new regimes. So we'll be looking at that today with regards to risks, who owns them and who's liable for them, who's to blame, really, if you like, if anything goes wrong. Because we know that MSPs tend to find themselves frequently asked by clients to take responsibility for the client data. Helping those clients to take responsibility for their own internal cybersecurity would probably be under this new bill that we hope will become the act fairly soon. The MSP will have greater responsibility, and possibly even for the first time with some of their clients. So we know quite a lot of those MSPs are actually nervous about the fact that they're coming into scope. David, what are the risks that they run, and how do we identify those in this new environment?
What we're kind of seeing is actually MSPs really kind of need to make these risks kind of clear, what's happening to the customer, what are them, and have that kind of documented, because it's really easy to have, 100 discussions, and then actually nobody can really remember what happened last week, let alone kind of discussions that might have happened months ago. And that really does mean another level of kind of risk management for them. I think what we're seeing is many MSPs are, hoping, and I guess we all hope, that their disclaimers will kind of work. But I think that the amount of tech and the amount of operations that they deal with, disclaimers may not be good enough. Because, it leads in kind of grey areas, who does what, who owns what, and does the customer even realize they own some of this risk?
Well, that's a conversation we've been having recently with a number of MSPs, that they feel the need to beef up their disclaimers, if you like, in their service level agreements. And is that something that you would recommend they do?
I think it's probably a good idea. I think what we haven't seen is whether it's kind of actually testable. That, will it survive? And I kind of suspect not. It's a bit kind of like getting your car fixed. You have the MOT once a year, but if you've got something wrong with your car, Whose problem is that? Is that the garage's because you never told them? Or is it yours?
And so really the client themselves are going to have to start taking responsibility for their own rather than just
Absolutely.
And within the client, who owns the risk for data and cybersecurity? Is it an IT issue?
Yeah, that's a question we come up against quite a lot. And I think there's often confusion between who operates and manages the task according to a technology than who owns the risk of that technology. So a favorite example is if finance wants a nice financial package cloud-based and they buy it, IT may well allocate the users, allocate the resources, and kind of make sure that the basic functionality works. But are they really responsible for the availability of? And especially if you bought a finance piece of software that's maybe kind of got different levels of resilience, it's really down to the finance people to decide what level of resilience and availability they want. If it's a global company, then they want it resilience across the world. And if they haven't bought that, yes, the IT people have a responsibility maybe to explain it to the finance people, but it cannot be their call of owning that risk.
Is this going to affect cyber insurance policies for MSPs, do you think?
I think we're seeing this already. We're seeing kind of definite verticals where the insurance companies are strongly encouraging, certification in standards, cyber essentials to reduce the cost.
Yeah, and ISO presumably ISO 27.
Oh,
So with regards to the MSP services that they're offering to their clients, these are going to be regulated in a far more stringent way with the new laws. So they are responsible for a certain number of things. And obviously, Oliver and Robert, you'll find this with some of the products that you're offering, that patching, monitoring, identity and access control, these kind of things, response, these are now really very much the MSP's game, isn't it? That they need to be taking responsibility for.
Yeah, I mean, I think from the just covering some of the other points as well that Dana was making is really key and critical, even for this part, right? This new bill is going to make them legally accountable for security and resilience in some regards, or in some areas for sure. And I think the clarity is the key part for me. A lot of conversations that we have with MSPs when you try to ascertain what they're offering to their customers, and also talking to the customers on the other side of it, there's a misunderstanding in a lot of cases around how far they go with the services, getting the same level of service from their MSP. And that may be just due to the fact that the MSP hasn't scoped it because it wasn't a requirement from the client. It may be that the client has a budget that's affecting them and they obviously can't afford to maybe cover all of these services. It may be they've got some capability of their own and they feel like they can cover it themselves. But certainly we've had conversations with MSPs in the past where they're not contractually bound to do things like patching, which I would argue is one of the most critical things they should be doing. That's the one thing organizations just don't have the time, the expertise, or the experience to do and deal with. And when you start looking at technologies to do things like patching, there's a level of inconsistency to how far they're willing to go. Actually, I've heard a lot of direct conversations with customers of our partners where they're stating that the technology they're using for things like patch management doesn't really cover all the bases. So I think there's a clarity element of it. What's their responsibility? What's the customer's responsibility? What can technology do and offer to them?
And that spreads through to the supply chain as well. And we know that some of the MSPs are also responsible or hoping to manage or planning to manage the supply chain of their clients. And that can go third, fourth, fifth level. That's quite a responsibility.
Yeah, I mean, that was a surprise to me around different regulations, but relevant as well, I think, here, because of the way that the Cybersecurity Resiliency Bill is being framed, in the sense that the government will have a lot more responsibility to enforce suppliers that they think are critical to be pulled into scope for this. And it was similar within the DORA regulation as well, which targets financial institutions, that actually you can see scenarios where, due to the important role that a supplier provides, they will be pulled into scope, and it could be 5 or 6 layers that could be pulled into scope. And again, in some cases, I think you'd find that even fairly small players, smaller organizations that maybe haven't considered this, that their obligations here are suddenly, put into a strict strategy, strict process of trying to address, what they're doing around their security and they probably have their own suppliers. So I think it's definitely going to be a flowing down of this into lots of different organizations in lots of different areas that may not be directly, respond or not directly in scope. It may seem when you look at the face of what cybersecurity resiliency build is trying to target.
I think the key thing really we believe is that wherever we are with the risk, who owns the risk, what the level of liability is, the service level agreements, everything needs to be documented. And David, I know with various rules and regulations there are out there now, evidence, documentation is absolutely critical to make sure that there's a record and an audit trail for this kind of stuff.
I think what we've seen is, and I think it's in the CRA documentation and some of the surrounding comments on that, is that they want it to align with NIS2 and DORA, which is obviously European legislation. Both those pieces of legislation are very kind of tough on third-party suppliers, especially ICT. And, the DORA one, you can read the DORA legislation until you realize there's another 3 acts that support it, which go into much more detail about what's expected from ICT. And then how do you get that business, which is obviously going to be a good source of revenue, and B, how do you prove that what you're doing is up to standard? And, I think the bit that we're talking about is how do we kind of make sure where the boundaries are between the MSP and the customer? The customer has to take some responsibility. And if they say they don't want to do something, that's their risk. It shouldn't be the MSP's risk.
And we can measure the risk appetite of the client through a security forum, for example, and through this documentation that we're talking about.
Where things get signed off and approved and documented, absolutely.
I think that's where the clarity bit for me comes in as well, is that in lots of scenarios where I've had conversations with organizations over the years, having a consistent, well-formatted way of documenting risk that's not overly complicated and feels too technical is really important. I think that it needs to be framed in such a way that anybody in the business, no matter where they sit or what they do, should be able to read that risk and understand it and say, that's sensible, and understand why we're trying to address this risk and understand how we're going to address it. Should be pretty clear, even at a high level. It's like, why is this important? What's causing it? Why is it important? And what are we thinking about doing about it? I think that also then just elevates the conversation up, which the whole cybersecurity resilience field is doing this, moves it higher up the business to be a business conversation rather than what ordinarily would be seen as a technical challenge we've got to overcome, which we all know is not the right approach. So for me, clearing up that kind of understanding of risk is really important. And again, like simplifying like we've done on this slide helps people in the areas of the business to really understand what it's all about. And, even things like risk appetite, we know humans are bad at assessing risk. Like we've all got different understandings of risk and what we feel is risk. Some people are happy to drive down the road without a seat. Others would always do. It's just a natural thing you do. But that's because their assessment on risk is very different from somebody else's. And if you get that wrong in a business, somebody has got no concern about this particular risk, but there's somebody else that really cares about it and thinks it's really important. Yeah. And sometimes it needs other people involved in the organization to identify those risks, not just the leadership either. So it's not just the leadership problem. It's not just a technical problem. It's the company's thing. How many businesses get out there and sort of be very transparent about their risks or their concerns?
Exactly. And that's certainly what we find with things like the risk register and the security forums, and then actually making the leadership, the senior management team, own a risk and actually identify their own level of risk assessment. And that comes for when you have those kind of security.
It's hard, right? Because there's all that also, like I say, about risk appetite. Sometimes there's a question of, well, do we have any risks? Like, why haven't we added these in the risk register recently? Are we missing something? Or have we just, there's nothing to worry about right now? It's rare that you haven't got something you should probably be putting on your risk register. Maybe there's a feeling of, well, it's not important enough to put it on the risk register. There's so many different reasons why I think it, sometimes people have overthought this process, and we've discussed the talk, right, where they're taking policies and procedures and looking at what a good practice looks like, and then maybe overthinking it. Let's just focus on what you do now and get that, document what you're doing right now. And if it needs tweaking and stuff, you can probably do that over time. There's got to be some lengthy, crazy process. It often doesn't even need to be, right? It's kept simple.
We're going to
It's overwhelming.
talk about we're going to be talking about the resource level in that we do know that there are many smaller MSPs who are thinking, well, hold on, does this apply to me? Because you don't think the Resilience Act bill is actually clear. It's a little bit confusing, isn't it, with regards to whether this applies to all MSPs or just some of the bigger ones. But where responsible for sort of critical national infrastructure, they have to be responsible, surely.
Yeah, there definitely has to be a level on there, and I think that's where it's going to come from. And the CRA actually defines different levels of types of MSP, depending on what they're doing. And it is a little bit confusing that some of the small ones, it looks like they're going to be out of scope. That would be through the most recent bill, and it looks like it's going to be very hard to be out of scope, even if you're a small MSP. Not as easy as it kind of used to be.
So that actually does bring us to why governance matters, but also the bureaucracy and the level of resource that's going to be required for all MSPs, small and large, because, there's a lot that they need to be looking at, a lot that need to be put in place to make sure that they are taking the liability, taking the responsibility seriously. Presumably, Robert and Oliver, this is where you can help.
I think this is a good thing for MSPs and organizations because it feels to me that strong governance will shift from being a technical task to being a core organizational priority. And I think it then should ensure that there's the right level of investment proportionate to defending that kind of regulation, right? To having the proportionate controls. And I think this is an important thing, but maybe Robert can talk to it a bit more deeply about what we're seeing with customers is sometimes it's about the level of investment that they want to put into a technology or a solution or solving a problem. If not in alignment with reality, the business has given them a level of investment funding to help solve security, then in reality, they should be spending a lot more. And I think that's always been the challenge with cybersecurity is there's no direct correlation or relation from a successful business yet and implementing good security controls. Whereas what we believe in the cybersecurity industry, maybe it's just because we're backing ourselves, is that actually if good security is in place, you should be able to win more opportunity. These sorts of requirements will drive businesses to need you as an MSP and as an organization as a whole. And if you don't have it, you won't win the business as an MSP.
That's critical. They've got to get their own house in order before they can actually go out there and win new business. Yes, those of them that are seen to have these kind of things in place will definitely be the ones that can win additional business and growing revenue. Definitely.
I think it's really important as well, though. If you take a step back and look at really successful MSPs, there's a couple of key things that they're doing really well, and that's what's driving them forward, which we can maybe get into later. But I think the key thing for me is that, definitely from our perspective, this is a great thing because it helps bring the right conversations to the board. What we know is, of course, has it worked in the past, is that if you look at the press, there's so much going on right now. There's so many big breaches, so many big hacks, so many big disruption that's happened that's fundamentally affected organizations. And actually, the assessment done by the government showed that they think that it's had a direct impact on GDP for the UK. 0.5% of GDP has been affected by cyber breaches. That starts to change the conversation from the board. And that's what should change the conversation about what's proportionate, how much money are we currently spending on these sorts of things, and how much should we be spending on the right levels of control, and who are we using, who are our suppliers, and are we confident that they can help us to meet this challenge? Robert, you probably bumped into it more from a commercial perspective, right? And the viewpoint of security.
One of the main challenges that your small, medium, and even large MSPs are facing is the dream not providing security at all, knowing they might have to, and or it could be a revenue generating resource for them to providing security. And the biggest lag behind is it's not their expertise, right? They didn't get into the business of security off the bat. So the education for them, things like knowing their liability and where that crosses, sometimes it's easier just to say, well, we don't provide it, we shouldn't be liable. But as we discussed, that's changing now. So I think the education piece of, hey, I want to provide security, know how to, and even if I knew how to, I have a budget, I have things I need to stay in line with, and I can just go hire an internal SOC team, extremely populated with different vendors, different solutions, different acronyms like XDR, MDR, EDR, understanding what that means for an MSP, and then also how to translate that to sell your client, right? Because you've got to become an expert to then re-educate your client to why they need to use security. When the flip side, I think Ollie's right in saying, if you don't do it, a client will come to you and say, hey, do you provide this? And you say, well, they're going to go somewhere else. And if they go somewhere else that also provides managed services, you may lose that business as well. So today's day and age for the average MSP, they're in a very tricky spot of trying to navigate path of least resistance, but also fundamentally changing their business model.
It's interesting you were talking about MDR, XDR, all those kind of acronyms. Of course, and we also talked about cyber breaches and cybersecurity incidents, and we've talked about the supply chain. Incident response and reporting is definitely a very major part of the new bill that's coming in. David, your favorite expression is escalation in regards to incidents, but the MSP need to be on the ball here, don't they, in order to make sure that any incident that happens within the supply chain is recorded and reported in the right way.
Oh, absolutely. And it's then complying with the time constraints. What we're now seeing kind of around Europe and the UK, potential regulator reporting times can be anything between 4 hours and 72 hours. You may not know enough even after 72 hours, but you may need to be in a position where you can manage this to a level where you can at least give regulators and customers the appropriate heads up. One of the things that we've seen a few times is quite often on this, you do need board level or CEO decision making. And that really means board and CEO has to be available, and they have to be available, unfortunately, maybe awkward times. So we can get a business decision really quickly and act on it rather than actually go, we're doing stuff, but I think we may have to either spend more or make some business sacrifices pretty early on.
Well, that's where the resource conversation comes in, because they're going to need greater resources in order to be able to comply with some of the regulation demands, aren't they? Presumably tools like yours, Ollie and Robert, they're going to help organizations minimize the level of disruption within an organization, but also be able to be as compliant as they possibly can.
Yeah, I think the other thing that we've tried to do within the platform, and I'm not intending it to become a sales pitch by any means, but to just give the clarity on the important part of this, is that often the technology that you use is so complicated and technically enabled to support more IT savvy people that actually providing board oversight when it matters most is really difficult, because as an IT person, as an MSP, how do I get all this information to a format that I can expose it to the board and they'll get it? It's still just jargon, and that's maybe why they're not so involved in the incident response process. And the regulators are now expecting them to be part of this problem, solving the problem, and also the communication to client. Right? It sounds to me like, I was reading the bill itself suggests that you've got to be really transparent with your clients about what's going on, and it's not just about communicating it to the regulator; it's communicating to your customers. You don't want to make that. You don't want to do that badly. So what we've tried to do with our system is to actually, and again, sorry for everybody that heard it way too many times, but AI is really good at summarizing this stuff into a format for anybody. So we've actually exposed our platform in such a way that if anybody needs to go and ask a question of what is the incident we're facing, what are the current threats, make it something that anybody can understand. Like, provide it as a board executive summary of where we're at currently now with our incidents. It's something that's now believable through innovation and technology, which we think is the most important part. It's like exposing it in the most simplest way to somebody that you can immediately just push it out into the leadership team as that clear summary that's been, AI to the point that somebody now can understand it, and the key points and the things that the actions and things being delivered are documented and all there and clear and actionable, right? And that defines the ownership. It shows it's measurable. It provides that continual improvement capability. So for us, that's what's always led Target and lots of different people in lots of different parts of the organization. And it can't be just techies. It's got to be more than that.
Well, it's got to be a strategy. We've got to have a strategy in place before we can actually put the resources and the technology and the operations in place for that. I'm wondering, David, with the CAV, which is the National Cybersecurity Centre's framework, would that help to develop that strategy, which then leads?
I think it would. I think that it's quite a high level, but actually the deeper you go in it, you realize you've got to kind of look at this from both ends. And I think it does a really kind of nice job of kind of explaining that much of this is about how you manage the whole cyber cycle from beginning to end. It's easy to say, I've got a virus checker and that's all I need. The trouble is, 2 weeks later, things could well have changed and you may need more. Who makes that decision? Who manages it? Who changes those decisions? And bear in mind, suddenly you've got an incredibly complex environment, and those changes have a knock-on effect. So everything has to be taken into account, and it comes down to how you manage it rather than necessarily what the technology is.
The new law, the bill, as will be, is changing some of the responsibilities, isn't it? And we're hoping it's going to make clearer boundaries. But Robert, Ollie, do you think that the MSPs are generally taking responsibility for this already, or are they going to have to make some fairly major changes within their organisations to address some of these areas?
I think certainly not every MSP is equal, I would say, and obviously the level of service they can offer. So I think that there are definitely tools and technologies that we're commonly finding in place satisfy a lot of the requirements that I think MSPs will lean into and say, we already do these things and we're very good at these things. And they are, don't get me wrong, they are very good. And that's why organizations go to them. But I think there are fairly significant changes that we're seeing that many miss or don't have the capacity to provide services around, which are significant investments. And over my years of experience in working with partnerships and partners, there's often a feeling of like, we want to be able to deliver this capability ourselves. Specifically, a lot of the times around things like proactive monitoring and monitoring environments. And of course, it makes sense, right? They're very close to the customer. They've got lots of technology already in place. They can do a lot of that monitoring and systems. But then they realize the complexity of it all. Like they may be used to having a network operations center that's familiar with looking at log data and looking at infrastructure and systems. But suddenly they then realize that actually a lot of the threats that you see specifically in log data is very nuanced. You need the very specific skill set to figure out whether that's good or bad. And yes, you may be able to put eyes on certain parts of your environments and customers' environments to elevate those things that you may think is abnormal. But the wider nuances are the things that are very difficult to detect with technology. It needs expertise, it needs skills, it needs knowledge. And that seems on the face of it as something that's simple to do, but then actually delivering that as an outcome to a customer becomes a very difficult problem to solve. And then inevitably what happens is they lean on technology to try and solve that problem without the service wrapper, where the service wrapper is actually the thing that adds the most value to the partner and can actually deliver the best outcome for their customers. So I do think there's a decent part of it that maybe is being overlooked. And I think there's plenty of opportunity there as well, right? I think high growth MSPs are turning everything into automation services, right? The more you can get on as reoccurring services for consultants and MSPs, moving away from this idea of like one-off bits of work for the client is really attractive to investors. It's really attractive to the business, right? It gives the consistency. And also the other thing that security often adds is stickiness in your clients, right? Which MSPs are generally quite good at. Maintaining customers is great, but I think you might see a shift now where you will start losing customers if you don't really think about security, and it's not necessarily something you should really think to own. I wonder whether the MSPs have started looking at contractually their service providers like Microsoft. Actually, they state in a lot of the T's and C's that they're not responsible for backups and all those sorts of things. And that worries me as well. Like backups is a big thing for everybody, especially from a security perspective. You need to get the door quickly. Do your suppliers offer you the same level? Have you thought about that?
That's a very good point. Very good point. Yeah. We'll come back to that in a second. I just want to pick up on something you said there about alliances. And it was interesting at the MSP Global Conference that we were at in October, that there were two main themes that came across in some of the research that they had undertaken with MSPs and also with investors and venture capitalists who are looking to bring more and more MSPs together in a larger group. One was, which was great and music to our ears, was that the compliance as a service is a fairly major trend that we can see growing over the course of the next few months. And that will definitely increase the level of engagement with clients and the stickiness, as you call it. But how do they deliver that? And that was the second theme, which was alliance partnerships. And smaller MSPs and wanting to grow, wanting to become bigger, wanting to increase the stickiness and the engagement with their client are going to have to start looking at alliance partnerships for strategic consultancy, compliance, this other types of consultancy. And I think that's a theme that we're seeing more and more, but was very much the message when we were at the MSP Global earlier this year. So I think, just wanted to make the point that that is something that we're definitely seeing as a trend towards. But actually, coming back to your point there about MSP's own suppliers and the extended supply chain. David, have you come across MSPs looking at the likes of Microsoft, their service level agreements and disclaimers? That's something
I think what we've seen is quite often those service level agreements and contracts are really complex. I mean, how many times have we worked on an incident only to find out loggy was only available for the last 3 months? I think companies often don't realize logging for 3 months is better than nothing, but actually quite often you need it for a lot more. But it was probably the cheapest entry point into something like Microsoft or Google or whatever. And that was what they offered, not realizing every component can have a knock-on effect. And even the backups can be different, and the interpretation of the backups can be different of what you're buying. And it's really maybe making some of that clear. I think just signing a contract and not fully understanding the impacts of what you're paying for is what we're seeing companies pay the price for.
And is that an MSP's responsibility, or should the customer be looking at as well?
It's probably a shared responsibility to some level.
Yeah.
You do expect the dealership to explain to you some of the ins and outs of the car. Although you do know how to drive it, you do know that there are speed limits in place, and you do have a duty of care. It's a similar type of thing.
So using your analogy with the MOT, if the client makes the decision not to do something, presumably the MSP needs to make sure that's documented, but they're no longer necessarily responsible.
Oh, absolutely. I think those lines have really got to be well defined. I think if there's any vagueness, the MSP potentially could be in the firing line.
And that should be done how, in the SLA as a disclaimer, or is that something that the MSP should insist on some kind of security risk for them?
The thing is, if you put it in SLAs and contracts, just that things change throughout the year the whole time. How do you keep things up to date and relevant? And that maybe only is a combination of both. Maybe a level in the contracts and SLAs and having an agreed, approved, signed off by senior leadership, the risks on a regular basis.
Where are the main changes then? We've been talking about shared responsibility, but where are the main changes in the CRA or the CRB bill as it is at the moment? What are the key things that MSPs need to be aware of?
A number of times we've seen, we have a managed security service, it's their problem. Actually, it probably isn't. What it is you are having a service that manages tasks and operations. They are not necessarily managing end-to-end security and making decisions. And I think it'd be impossible for them to do that. They can't make a decision to say, we have to shut down these services till we fix them. That needs to be the business to make those decisions. So it's kind of got to be joined, but understand that, you are outsourcing tasks mainly, then operations. You're not necessarily outsourcing decision-making, which is absolutely critical for the cyber. When we look through ISO 27001, for example, it looks like a lot of paperwork or whatever, but actually 75% of it requires a judgment call.
Yeah.
Who makes those judgment calls and who decides on those judgment calls?
But again, we come back to documentation, evidence, all this kind of stuff that needs to be seen. Should there ever be an audit of whatever by the regulator or whoever, that needs to.
And it's the first line in defense, because you don't have that. Saying that I spent 3 months ago and said this doesn't really help you.
Exactly.
I think there's two parts to that as well, isn't there? Like when you go through an assessment of some kind, you're relying heavily on your MSP to provide you with a lot of the evidence, because maybe you don't have anybody in the business that really is responsible for that. For example, I'm going to say in Cyber Essentials, can you give us an asset list? The MSP is going to have to pull that together, right? It's unlikely the business is going to know how to go get that. And I think the second part to it is during an incident, when we're having to report back now within 24 hours, you need a decent SLA and a decent way of getting that information out. So the MSP is going to need the business to make some calls, right? And give some clarity, and need to work really closely together. And I think that's the thing that's always been the thing. And when we talk to MSPs, it sounds like they have some relationship with their partners where it's very much a transactional relationship. The cybersecurity stuff, as far as we're seeing with MSPs that are being really successful with their customers, it's more of the extension of their team. And that's not for every MSP, right? Not every MSP's got the capacity across all their customers to be that close to their customer. It feels like they definitely need to, and especially now, if you need to have this real clear clarity of who's doing what when you've got only 24 hours to make a call on it. I found that initial judgment call.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there is a kind of clear understanding on many areas of what best practice is. Whereas maybe 10, 15 years ago, it was kind of lovely to have, but I think US government, UK government, and Cyber Essentials have really accelerated that learning of what best practice is. So it's kind of the best analogy, guys. When you go to the supermarket, you expect the food to be fit for purpose. You can eat it and it won't kill you. And I think the same has got to be part of what if you provide a service. This is what it is, and this is what you can expect. Either you pay more to have it or you do it yourself. And I think those kind of things have got to be really clear.
And combining those two things, best practice and resource limitations, Oliver, you believe very strongly that you need to find a methodology that the MSP can use that they can then deploy as and when anything happens.
Yeah, I think for me, what I've found is I've sometimes banged my head against a brick wall when people are asking, when they're looking at these standards, the reality is they're all trying to do very similar things. And most of them are really just pushing best practice. You shouldn't really treat them any differently. It's almost like, if you want to meet Cyber Essentials Plus, you should be trying to find a way to make sure that it maps to all of the other standards and controls that you've got so that you can easily then go on to say, well, actually, we could go and do ISO 27001 next one. Or how are we doing with NIS2? Well, actually, we're probably covering a lot of the bases here with maybe a slightly different take on some of these things to kind of help make sure we are meeting the specific requirements. But I think the definite thing for me is that the MSPs being clear on the fact that they have this technical resource in the mix. And there are still going to be lots of controls and things that need to be done by the MSP that the business needs you to do, that you've got to be capable of and willing to support them to do. So you can't take that out from your contractual obligations. You should be covering those bits. That's what you should hold your hand up and say, I'm willing to take this on. And that then means that the response and all that sort of comes along with it. Basically, don't reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of existing compliance out there that drives the same level of consideration around things like incident response and other areas. It's important. Ultimately, these standards are just trying to guide you, right? The guidance. And the reason why they become more aggressive around regulatory fines and stuff is they're not creating the right level of traction and they need to get some teeth, right?
Yeah.
But I think, like you mentioned earlier, Penny, the most exciting thing if I'm an MSP looking at this is going, well, actually, ongoing compliance and monitoring services is recurring revenue for us as a business. We want to be doing this stuff for our clients. They want us to do it. We should actually build the capability around it so we can sell it. We can add value to what we're doing. We can get higher revenue contracts, for example, or we could offer a more premium service to our customers if we wanted to. We can upsell to existing clients, say, look, this is coming. Here's a great opportunity for us where we can provide more service for higher revenue. That's great. That we all want. There's not all we
Completely agree. And I think, we believe very strongly that some sort of compliance strategy that they can then use and implement with clients as well as with themselves, obviously, is a great way for them to increase that the sales revenue and increase the engagement with the client.
Robert, I mean, that's one thing we've heard from customers more and more is just, almost like more of that guidance, more of like, what more can you offer me?
No, I think that's right. And one of the things that I think we've been talking about together is doing a review for an MSP to sort of explain to them what they need to do, where the gaps perhaps in their services are. I think this would be something that clearly we can work with them on, which would really help. As we're sort of coming towards the end here, just really to summarize, I'd like all of you to sort of summarize the key points that you feel the CRA is bringing into sharp focus with regards to responsibility. David, clear boundaries, clear responsibilities.
Yeah, and I think the one thing that is true, and it's true in most legislation, even going back to the good old days of GDPR, is managing incidents and managing them quickly and responding fast. And what we've seen is having that escalation procedure, because, we've got to companies, what do you do if there's a problem? Who are you going to call?
Yeah.
And if you can't answer that question straight away, there's already a problem and there's a delay. That if the answer's on page 95 or the 19th document down, you've already kind of lost. You just to be really, really quick, really fast, getting the right people dealing with stuff as soon as possible. And it still might be a bad outcome, but it will definitely be a better outcome than you would have done if you hadn't done it.
Robert, just to summarize, what do you think are the key concerns the MSPs you're coming across have got and how should they approach this?
I think the general overall rule of thumb for the MSP world and our clients is peace of mind. The clients are looking for the MSPs for peace of mind. The MSPs need to assure them, but also have their own personal peace of mind. And I think going through assessments and creating clear responsibility matrices and boundaries within policies, procedures, documentation for MSPs in general is going to create that. And you don't have to be perfect, but if you're not working on this pathway to either become compliant or aligning yourself to the app, and you're not going to be able to assure your clients, and therefore you're not going to be able to win business in the future either.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely true. Yeah. And Oliver, what's your summary of all of this?
I mean, I'm looking at somebody who's running a business and I just can see opportunity, right? I think strategic suppliers becoming compliance partners is going to be the case. I think, like you said, automation is key to that. Many MSPs due to their size, but also providing a repeatable service architecture, meet the compliance should make it a lot more repeatable for you as an MSP to provide a successful outcome. How many years have we talked about security and compliance by design? How often do we actually see it in implementation, even through MSPs? No, there's such an opportunity here. I think it should be capitalized on while the clients are going to be expecting it. Make it a success.
I agree. And I think, I believe that there's help out there. So don't struggle along with this on your own. There is help out there. And going back to what we were talking about earlier, and you bring in alliance partnerships that specialize or are experts in specific areas to help you give a better service to the client and a more sticky service to the client. Thanks very much, guys. It's a subject I'm sure that will rumble on as the bill becomes an act. There may well be more clarity, we hope. But thank you very much for the start of a very interesting discussion, which I'm sure we'll carry on in future webinars. Thank you.
Thanks, Penny. Thanks, David.
Thanks very much, Robert.